I think for those of us growing up in Indian households, like you said, we're not used to necessarily hearing the I love yous and good jobs and thank yous and, I'm really proud of yous, even though they're implied, they're meant, and it's done through the actions. Parents will say, well, I don't need to tell you that I love you because I show you every single day. I cook for you, I clean for you. What else do you need? But the reality is sometimes hearing it also helps psychologically. And, as much as we think sometimes that Western society is formal, too formal in offering thank yous and pleases and I'm sorries, the reality is that little bit of cordial attitude goes a long way, especially in how we as parents then go back and treat our own children. And I think even in the first generation here, you'll see that there is a distinct difference in how the first generation parents are treating their kids versus how many of us who came over as immigrants were treated as children from our own family environments. No less loving, just different. And it's apparently good for sales because Mr. Laksu's book sold 2,000 copies after the Amy Chua memoir came out. So I think people are stirred up by this and they're willing to spend the dollars to read more about it.
Well, I found a very interesting piece in the New York Times about learning and development. And the title reads, "To really learn, quit studying and take a test." Sounds kind of weird, right? What do you mean quit studying? All we've been taught is to study and study harder and study more. Well, basically, there were 3 different kinds of learning methods that were evaluated in the study that came out in the journal Science. They compared just testing, which is recalling something from a passage you just read, to 2 other kinds of methods. One is repeatedly studying the material. The other is having students draw a detailed diagram documenting what they're learning, right? This is called concept mapping in the education world. And many educators believe that concept mapping is the way to go because you really see how different pieces fit together. What this study is revealing is that recall and memory is definitely enhanced by testing. Having that test is really what it's all about. In fact, one of the lead authors of this study said, learning is all about retrieving, all about reconstructing our knowledge. So we have a lot of assumptions in the field of education about how this kind of construction of concepts is really important to understand. And it may very well be, but we do need to back that up with some more data because right now what this most recent study is showing is that actually being asked to recall something means that you're going to remember it for a longer time, not just like reading it over and over again or understanding where the idea came from. It's actually being able to produce and recall or retrieve what you learned.
What if you're a lousy test taker?
No, it brings up a good point because a lot of people are like, oh my God, too much emphasis on testing and this is a problem. I think the question should be not should we test, but how do we test? What do these tests look like? How are they designed? Because there clearly is a link between learning and testing, but sometimes students struggle with the stress of tests. And even what we're calling a test here may not really be that. I think it's just an idea of how you recall or retrieve. You don't even have to call it a test.
I just remember when I was in college, there were always those students that never ever showed up for class all semester long, and then they would show up the day of the final exam, and they'd do well on the exam, and they'd pass the class. And the professors, they would always say, well, your final exam is worth 80 or 90% of your grade. And that used to tick me off because I'd spend the whole semester trying to understand and learn the material when really all I needed to do was show up and take the test. I don't know. I don't know if I'm buying into that, but I guess the medical science shows differently.
Yeah, I think what it shows is that we need to study this subject even further. I want to share some news with you coming from India, kind of exciting on the environmental front. Did you know that there are such things as tidal power stations? We talk a lot about wind power and solar power. Well, apparently there's such a thing as tidal power.
You're talking about the ocean's tides.
Exactly. And so, that in the state of Gujarat, there is, it's right there next to the ocean, and Atlantis Resources is a company that's involved in a tidal farm they're planning to build in the Gulf of Kutch, right off of Gujarat. And so this tidal farm is expected to deliver more than 200 megawatts of energy. It could be pretty big. There are other such tidal farms in France, and there's plans for one in South Korea. And essentially, it's not, a huge electricity generation thing compared to some other alternative energies. But this is something new for India that we haven't done before, and Gujarat has a significant resource in the waters off its coast. So this is an opportunity, really, for the state and for the country to build on that. There's also some pretty good skills in that region in terms of turbines and the development and construction of turbines. So this is something that we expect to see in the next couple of years coming up off the state of Gujarat.
Makes you wonder why they haven't done this in tsunami-prone regions or something, because you think there'd be a lot of waves.
Yeah, you would.
Because of the storms, but it's different, and you never know. It could end up succeeding. Here is a story from NPR, which at the outset I was kind of disturbed by, and then as I read further, I realized, no, maybe it's a positive thing. Ever since Slumdog Millionaire came out, there have been a lot of touring companies that have started to do tours in the slums. And, of course, in part to see the kids that live in these terrible circumstances. And the reality is, especially in places like India, which are up and coming, there are slums. And there are children that live in very impoverished circumstances. And if you read the stories, it'll break your heart about how these little kids, boys and girls, really they make their money by begging, some of them, or by doing menial chores. But the reality is life is harsh, and so they have to end up spending that money every single day because they can't hang on to it. It'll be stolen, or the adults will come and take it from them. And so these kids get into a lifestyle of spending their money on entertainment or on drugs or on the wrong things just to try to burn what they earn in a day. They live basically for a day. So these touring companies have made somewhat of a spectacle out of these kids. But there is a positive outcome to this in that many of these touring companies have actually also helped set up these community shelters. One of them is called Salam Balak, and it's one of a number of groups that are helping street kids in India who basically will have a shelter, a community center that they can come to where they can sleep, they can rest, and where they can make at least a viable existence for themselves. So tourists come, they will check out these community centers, and actually it puts a positive spin on the whole thing because, many of them are moved into giving charitable donations, but they also see that there is some positive attitude. These kids are happy in these community centers. So in a way, these tourists are helping these community centers help the kids who live in these very terrible and tragic conditions. I think sometimes what can seem to be pretty negative on the outset as an initiative can actually have some good and positive influence in the community.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. It just kind of makes my stomach tighten and turn when I hear that poverty is a spectacle and it's something that tourists can come and look at and gawk at and then go home. I've heard people, who when they return from a visit to India and someone says, "How was your